He's a Ruby programmer and consultant at Obtiva. And if you're here expecting an hour on why Rails is awesome, I don't think you're going to get that. It's going to be a little bit different here. So yeah, let's get started.
Thanks, Tom. Yeah, totally. My talk is a little bit of gripe, a little bit of controversy, and hopefully some useful knowledge. We'll see what happens there. So this is me. I've been programming for about 12 years, and I'm pretty sure this picture is from about 12 years ago. I had to go on the Wayback Machine in order to find it. When I started programming, when I was a self-taught programmer and I started learning Perl, the web was kind of an afterthought in what we did. It was kind of a test bed, things where we would go to try new things. The people that I was, working with in IRC channels and stuff like that were programming adventure games and IRC bots for learning how to program and learning the ins and outs of a programming language. Also back then, it sounds so long ago, or I'm making it sound so long ago, but 10 years ago is really not that bad. It was kind of a wild west, I kind of call it, of open source technologies, because you came to a language like Perl and you're pretty much doing everything on your own. You got bare metal, and you had to learn how to interact with a web request or open a socket and do these things. And like I just mentioned, the web even more. Like the web wasn't the thing to do, so you were on your own when you were to go about actually deploying a web application. These days, it's a lot different. Programmers almost exclusively, a lot of times, go directly to the web because the web's everywhere. Like iPhones and Android phones, everyone has the web in their pocket. So that means whenever you deploy an application to the web, everyone has instant access to it. You don't have to wait for someone to download your application, or you don't have to wait for someone to pay for your application. It's just out there. Everyone has access to it, and it's a much tighter feedback loop. Also, these days we have frameworks, and frameworks get you a lot. For $0 now, a new programmer can come to PHP, Python, Ruby, and get a full database-backed web application with almost no experience. They can put something up, have something on the web, and actually get feedback as to whether their application is good or not. It allows you, web frameworks allow you to do something really quick, so you can put a web application up, you can start your web application, and it has these points where you can just get up and go. You start thinking about the business logic that's important to your application. You're not thinking about what your web server status needs to return or what web service you're going to deploy on to begin with. So I say these things because I think it highlights an approach between, a different approach between the people of old, I don't know, I don't want to say that, but from 10 years ago to the people of this day. And people like me that were starting out doing web applications 10 years ago had to learn the value of abstraction. We essentially, a lot of these things that come in frameworks that you're familiar with these days, we had to do them all, build them all ourselves. Like, we were building them in procedural, like I say, Perl's the example I'll go back to a lot. A lot of my applications started out as one file Perl scripts, right? And even they might have ways to get to different URLs and do different actions based on context, but still, we really had to build up all of our own abstractions based on the bare metal that was there. So when Rails came around and I had a chance to use it, it was a godsend, because all those things that I had been duplicating over and over and over again in the Perl and PHP applications of the time, Rails just did for you out of the box. You didn't even have to think about it. As a matter of fact, the first version of Rails came with a thing called Scaffold, which was amazing because you could have your controller, the place where your business logic lives, you put a single directive in there, scaffold, and then the name of the model that you were working with. with the data model. And bam, you would output views of all the things that you were working with. So you wouldn't have to build the forms for inputting data, showing the data, deleting. All that stuff was built in for you right away. And it was really powerful, and it was really amazing. And it made building web applications fun to do. And Rails was a great framework to work with. So going back to kind of this highlighted difference, Rails to me is kind of like these guys sparring. And imagine you're at a martial arts event, and they're fighting, they're going at it and stuff, and then bam, like someone's on the ground. Like all of a sudden, it was just totally crazy. To the people that are viewing it, and maybe even to the guy that's on the ground at that time, that appeared like one solid move, right? It was just in the middle of everything, and all of a sudden the guy's on the ground, and it feels like one solid move. But to the experienced martial artist, the guy that took that guy down, that was hundreds of variations, depending on the position they were in at the time, or the timing of the specific move, and maybe even some force was applied. But it wasn't as simple as just going from straight standing up to going flat on his back on the ground. And so Rails in many ways I think is like this. We, the observers, look at Rails like this move where we can just get a slam bam application out the door with almost no work, and it's just amazing. It's a flash. We see what Rails makes easy for us, and we can try it, and we'd probably be effective a lot of times because there's a lot of problems that Rails makes it really easy to solve. But then one day, when we come up against some experienced opponent, someone that knows this move a lot better than we do, then we're the ones that's going to be on our backs. And this happens a lot with Rails, and I have an example here that kind of shows this slight problem. So this is a Rails model, the data model, the data abstraction that you might use for your application. And you see here we have nice pretty names, you know, like a user belongs to an account, or a user has many posts. A very, very simple fluid syntax, and you get these amazing small little wins in the language for doing your data abstractions this way. But there's a slight problem with this. Does anybody know what it is off the hand? Like, is there a Rails program, people that have programmed in Rails that might know what this problem is? Okay. So this is a Ruby class, and when Rails starts up, it tries to load all the Ruby classes it can at one time, and everything that's listed in this class definition, except for our method definition there, gets evaluated at class load time. So we have this thing here in the middle. It's called a scope, and scopes basically evaluate to class level methods that we can call. So what we would do is we'd say users.recently signed up, and theoretically we would get all the users that have recently signed up to our application. The problem here is that the 30 days ago and time.now, we're putting in a date range there. And the problem is that in this particular example, too far? Yeah. The problem is in this particular example that 30 days ago and time.now, they get both evaluated whenever the class loads. So in production, whenever you deploy this app to production, this happens one time. The production server loads this class one time. At the time that it's loaded, those values are initialized and then never reevaluated again, because this class is cached. So every time you're calling recently signed up, the first time it's called, it's going to be probably close to what you think it's going to be. But then subsequent times, 30 days after the 30 days you loaded your Rails application, this is not going to work anymore. And it's very subtle because of the way that Ruby works. And if you were doing this for the first time and just copied this example from somebody else, you probably wouldn't notice this, especially because in development mode, when you're actually building a Rails application on your machine, Rails actually reloads classes every time it receives a request. So this example here, you wouldn't even know that this was a problem when you're developing on your local machine. So there are little things like this that Rails kind of like hides under the covers. It makes it hard for us to really understand what's going on. If you're interested in knowing, the the actual working code, similar to the code that I've shown, is this. We wrap it in what's called a lambda, which is essentially like an anonymous function. And the lambda, the way that Rails works, it only calls that anonymous function whenever it needs to be called, meaning that 30 days ago and time.now will be evaluated at the time it's needed. So this brings me to my first thesis, so to speak. Rails is not Ruby for beginners. You know, but Rails is easy and it's exciting, right? Yes, it's true, and especially for people coming to programming for the first time, people that are new to programming, or maybe even coming from like a statically typed language like Java or .NET. They may be wowed by what you can do in a very simple amount of time with Rails. But there comes a point in time where Rails hides too much, maybe hides too much about how it's interacting with the HTTP, or it becomes too magical with the fancy DSLs that it has, like the DSL that we kind of saw for describing relationships between particular data in your application. And then, of course, traditional Rails, and when I say traditional Rails, I actually mean Rails from previous to Rails 3. If you know anything about the Ruby community, Rails came out with a kind of a new big release at the beginning of this year. And previous to that, it was actually pretty difficult to go from the understanding of here is my data model that I'm coding and trying to dig into Rails' stack and understand what's going on and where things are happening. After Rails 3, they've refactored a lot of the internal APIs and it's getting better, but still, it's still a hard thing to try to go from Rails, your Rails to the Rails that does the actual work, and it's a lot of yaks to shave because you're starting out with something. If you're a beginner in all this, you're starting out from the browser request and trying to understand going all the way down to where is my HTML returned, right? That's just a lot of things to try to go down in. Also, Rails made a big change in the way that it decided to architect its applications after Rails 2. For people that are coming to the web for the first time, they may want to think URL like this points to just some random code that's run every time that you go to this URL, which is mostly true. But Rails 2 and Rails 3, they try to get you to try to think in nouns and resources, putting these all together in a fancy way, because they're thinking of large, complex systems that you're building with Rails. They're not really thinking towards the person that is a beginner to these technologies to begin with. So I'm here to suggest what I'm calling a path. I'm not calling this the path. I don't believe that I've found the nirvana of Ruby web programming, but I think it's something that I've learned. It's kind of mirrors the path that I've taken in learning to become a web programmer and being someone that is versed in Ruby and Rails. It kind of starts out with the way that I learned. Like I said, I learned with Perl and CGI, and we'll talk about how those things fit in. But again, we're going to take a look towards, and I want to give this kind of a holistic view. We're going to turn again to the martial arts, and this specifically, which you probably don't know what that is. This is Shuhari. This is a concept that comes from Asian martial arts. It's a model for skills acquisition. It has 3 different stages that you go through during the time in order to become a master in a particular skill. At the Shu level, which is the first character there, you focus on obeying. That's the thing that it kind of roughly translates to. You ruthlessly practice the fundamentals of whatever that you're doing until things become muscle memory. The second character stands for Ha. At this point, you begin to detach yourself from the fundamentals and you start working with those theories in real life practice. at this time, you're also making innovations in the way that you think. You're not just doing the fundamentals mindlessly anymore. You're starting to take these things and turning them into real life things. The last character here stands for re. At the re level, we begin to transcend the rules. The knowledge of what we do of this particular skill becomes tacit. We don't think anymore. We just do. We become unhindered by the rules, because in this case, in the case that we've become an expert in a skill, the rules don't apply to us anymore. It's the situations, we work in the situations where the rules don't apply. That's the way that we think as an expert or a master. So how do we apply this model to Ruby and the web? So let's look at this stage by stage. We're going to start out with the shoe stage because it's first. Like I said, this point we're talking about obeying. A word that comes to mind is dogmatic even. I know that word has a bad connotation, but I think it means something important here. So for me as a person, in my personal experience, the thing that really equates to me for this level and fundamentals is scales. How many people here have been involved in music in some shape or form? Okay. So when I did play the saxophone in middle school and a little bit in high school. And whenever we practice, one of the things that we had to do is every, I don't know, 3 to 6 months, the band director would, I think you would even have to schedule it. You'd have to come in and he would say, okay, play the C scale, play the D scale, play the F sharp scale. And you'd have to just rattle them off immediately. And knowing these things and knowing these fundamentals, if you know anything about music, scales are the thing that frees us from, or frees us to do the things that we want to do when it comes to actually improvising music. You play these scales over and over and over again, then whenever you're in a particular, you're playing a particular song, this is probably really well-known, or a thing that's well-known by someone that plays the lead guitar, for instance. When you hear them playing a solo or something like that, all they think of is, okay, I'm in the key of B flat. Now I can hit these particular notes on the string and just make them sound good. That requires knowing these scales without even thinking about them. And it's very important. So what is this in terms of Ruby? So the simplest Ruby that we can do at all, I think, is something like this. This is a Ruby script. You would run it on the command line, and when you do, it puts out the word. I say word a lot because I'm trying to bring back the 80s. But so yeah, this puts out the word. And it's the simplest thing you can do. We're calling a top-level method in Ruby called the puts method, and it just takes a string as an argument and outputs that string to standard out. So this is very simple. So what can we do to take this, the simplest Ruby, and web enable it? Well, take it back to my Perl roots and CGI roots, and boom. So now we're putting a HTTP header onto our application. So we're just saying this is text HTML, and we can run this in the command line the same way that we ran the first one, and all it's going to do is it's going to put out this content type ahead of our word. And it's that simple. Now, what that means is we can take this, we name it in a file called like word.cgi, throw it up on our favorite web server, and boom, this is a working web application, or web application, right? This is what we would call a script back in the day. No one writes web scripts anymore, though, I don't think. So we want to turn this into a web application. And it's not really very Ruby-ish, because there's not a lot of cases where you're actually building up Ruby applications that you're not working with objects. And it's definitely really hard to be automated, to do automated testing against this, which is something that's really important to the Ruby community as a whole. So what we're going to do is we're going to take this application, we're going to put it in a class. So we're going to start out with the basics of Ruby. We're going to put things in classes and objects. And so what I've done here is I've set up a class called myApplication, and I've got 2 methods on this class. One to set up the many headers that I'm going to set up in order for my web request to go back out. And then we're going to display word at some point. So we've got 2 methods there, and at the bottom here we're actually running it. So initialize a my application instance, and then run the setup headers method and run display word, and we get exactly the same result, but we've got objects. Woo! And so now we can write unit tests against these my application methods to prove that they do exactly what it is that I want them to do. To say that all the time I should display the word, or that for every web request should have a content type, something like that. This application is also encapsulated. It's starting to look more like object-oriented Ruby. So in this particular case, I'm starting to evolve this application a little bit more. I've abstracted the running of the application into a method inside the class. That way we can have a single insertion point for running our application. This is going to become important in the next slide. And then at the top, you see there, we've got some special case Ruby stuff going on. This is how you would write a class method in Ruby, so prepending the method name with self, or it could have been def myapplication.run would also do the same thing. Also, at the end of our method name, we have an exclamation point. This is something that's merely convention. It means what it means to your application. A lot of times in Ruby, you would see exclamation mark for methods that do something destructive. I kind of do this because this is the shortcut method for running run, so that we can get the kind of simple syntax at the bottom for running our application. Another special character that you might see at the end of a method is a question mark, which is generally used for predicate methods, saying whether something is true or not. Yeah, so we've got this single insertion point now that we can do a little bit more fancy stuff with our bare Ruby application. So here now, this looks a lot like the kind of stuff that I would do with Perl 12 years ago or whatever. So here now we've got our run method over on the left-hand side that's changed up a little bit. We've got a constant that is storing a hash of URLs and methods that we want to run when a particular URL is called. So we've implemented here a very simple router. And then we've added a couple of methods to do interesting things. I put in there specifically the dump env method because that's like the bread and butter of CGI applications. All the data that your web server passes over to a CGI application lives in the env, the environment variables. So yeah, and we could take this a little bit farther if we wanted to. We could refactor all of these like places where we've got just methods being called for each route in our application. We could refactor these to their own classes if we wanted to give them their own meaning, or if we had sub routes underneath them that we wanted to run in those particular cases. The con here, I mean, we've got a really simple web application. We've implemented, or we've included no libraries, no external third-party libraries, no standard libraries. This is all pure Ruby objects. The problem is that for everything that we do want to do, we're having to write our own abstraction to do it. Also, in the real world, CGI is slow these days. It's not, if you're putting up an application that's going to be hit by any number of people, CGI is probably not what you want to be deploying your application on. But I think it's still important to learn this. And so we're talking about the end. This is probably like encompasses what I would think of in the shoe level of web application development for Ruby. Understanding the base knowledge of what Ruby classes do, what particular method types like class methods versus instance methods, and just using base Ruby object types in your day-to-day work. And so we're moving to the kind of the next level of what where you would be, what next stage in the Shuari development. I wanted to present a particularly good example of why Shuari is important. Hopefully you can hear this. Let's see. I turned it up really loud. This gives a good example of why this method is particularly important, because when you ruthlessly practice the fundamentals of anything, the point is that you should end up with this knowledge where you should be able to respond to anything, and that's what the importance of this talk is supposed to be. So to illustrate this example in a very, very extreme way, I have a clip from, how many people have seen the new Karate Kid? How many people have seen the old Karate Kid? I hope, at least. Okay, I'm not going to ruin anything for you. This is essentially like a mirror scene of the old Karate Kid, but with Kung Fu, and it's really awesome. So I'm going to try to get this on here. Let's see if I do this.
This is stupid.
Can you hear that?
Done. They can beat me up if they want to. And you know why you only have one student? Because you don't know Kung Fu.
Okay.
What?
Come here. Check it on.
Mr. Han, I already...
Check it on. Check it on.
I don't have a jacket.
Check it on. Strong. Check it on. Firm. Check it off. Remember, always strong. Check it off. Strong. Left foot back. Right feet back. Left feet back. Pick up your jacket.
Ooh, Mr.
Focus.
Okay.
Always concentrate. Left back. Right foot back. Pick up your jacket. Stay. Pick up your jacket. Strong. Hang it up. Hang it up. Hang up. And editing. Strike. Hang up and attitude. Harder. Harder. Good. But no face. Check it out.
So yeah, what I didn't explain beforehand is that the only thing that this kid has learned, he's been told he's going to learn Kung Fu. And the only thing that he's learned up until this point is how to put his jacket up on like a pole, and then take it down, throw it on the ground, pick it up, put it on, take it off, put it back. That's what he's learned. And this whole time he's thinking he's learning how to, he's actually thinking he's learning a lesson because the guy, the Jackie Chan's character in the movie, he actually catches him leaving his jacket on the floor and his mom getting upset with him about it. So he thinks this whole time he's just learning a lesson about how he's a bad kid or whatever. But really what he's been learning, he's actually been learning Kung Fu. And it's an extreme example of how this is, but this illustrates the point of why the fundamentals are important. It's not just because you have to get your fundamentals, badge or whatever. It's because understanding these fundamentals, understanding how these things work at a low level is important to being able to improvise at the next level of your learning. So speaking of that, we'll move on. The next level in the Shu-Ha-Ri practice is Ha. I'm going to talk about how to take your understanding of the fundamentals and move them into kind of a innovative state where you focus on different parts of your learning experience. We have different priorities here, and so a couple of the things that the libraries we're going to talk about, they provide you with different points of view for what you're doing at a particular time. So the first one we're going to look at is probably the simplest, lowest level one, which is called Rack. And the focus here we're going to look at is designing common abstractions, focusing on modularity and portability. And to develop apps with Rack, we only have to follow two simple rules. First, we have an object class in Ruby, and it must define one method. And that method takes one argument called the environment, and that's it. This is half of a Rack application. And then the second rule is that it emits what we'll call the Rack spec. The Rack spec is an array where the first element is the HTTP status, the number. The second element is a hash of the headers you're going to pass back to your response. And then the third element is a array that has some content in it, and it's going to be passed back as the body of your application. The reason it's an array is that if you have some kind of chunked streaming response, this will allow you to do that. Excuse me. So this looks very, very similar to what we were doing with our CGI application, except for it's got a standard interface. And so if we take our CGI example and port it over to Rack, it looks like this. So this is doing the exact same thing that our base Ruby example was doing, except for now we can run this in any kind of Rack stack that we want. And there's a lot of cool things. Rack comes with a tool called Rackup that allows you to run Ruby applications with a command and it starts up a server and does all that stuff for you. There are cool libraries that hook in right to Apache and Nginx, like one particular called Passenger, that allows you to just put Rack applications up on a server and you point either Nginx or Apache to your particular instance of the application and it runs it. So it's completely portable. And so here we've just kind of duplicated all the stuff that we're doing before in the other application. Pretty much nothing new here, except for at the bottom, instead of calling myapplication.run, we're using Rack's run to run our application, and all we're passing is an object. And it's still just an object, still just a Ruby object, but it has a special method interface for what we want to do. So this application, though, is not completely 100% Rack compliant. And the reason that I say that is because when I first started doing Rack, and probably when I first started giving this presentation, this particular example was Rack compliant. But what they did is they added a requirement that every request needs to return a header of content length, and our application doesn't. This also gives me a chance to prove or tell you about another cool Rack feature, and it's called middlewares. And what middlewares allows to do is insert like smaller application-like things in a stack that's going to be executed whenever a request comes in. So for our example, I can't remember what version it was, but it was probably like a year and a half ago when the Rack core team introduced this new content length requirement. And so at the time when they did that, not everyone wanted to upgrade their applications to do to actually emit a content type, because to be honest, we're a little bit lazy as programmers. I mean, if I really wanted to emit the content length of this, I would have to get the return value of display word, then calculate the length of that, then inject that into my headers somehow that is returned with my Rack spec and do all that. And that seems like a lot of work for me. I'm a programmer, I'm lazy, so I want someone else to do it for me. And the Rack core team knew that I would be lazy, and so they gave me the content length middleware. So you see what we've done is we've just kind of injected at the very bottom above our application running, we're telling it to use the Rack content length middleware. And what this does actually is middlewares and applications in a Rack setup are this stack. And so what happens is when a request comes in, it's going to go down to Rack content length. It's going to say, well, you're on the way in, you don't have a body, the response doesn't have a body yet, I'm just going to ignore it and pass it down to the next thing in the stack. You're going to go down to my application, which is in the bottom of the stack, and it's going to say, okay, I'm the last thing, I'm going to return, you know, the response that we wanted. And the request is then going to go back up the stack, and when it comes back up to rack content length, it's going to say, hey, you don't have a content length, and I see that you have a body. Well, I'll just inspect that body and figure out what the length is and inject that into the headers before it goes back out to the request. And so as such, it works that way. And you can stack unlimited, assuming, amounts of middlewares in between your client request and your actual application to do any number of things that you might want to do. And I'll show you some examples as we go into the next section here. This is important for building larger systems based on these libraries, because these libraries are inherently very, very simple. And if you're going to build web applications that have lots of different content and lots of different parts of the application, then you're going to want to do something like this. So the next in this level I want to introduce is a library called Sinatra. Sinatra has a slightly different focus. It's actually based on Rack. It's a Rack application on its own, but it has its own DSL for describing particularly the interaction between URLs and the HTTP to our business logic, our actual application. So a very simple Rack or Sinatra application would be this. So this is all that the Ruby file would have to have in it. We're telling it, whenever somebody calls a GET request on the root, return the string hello world, and then it does all the rest for us. So particularly, like I said, the focus on the HTTP to action happening is really important with Sinatra. It also simplifies things in that we don't have to return silly things in order for the Rack server to understand what our application is doing. We can just return a string. The string could be HTML. It could be a call out to a templating system to do our thing or whatever. But if you notice, we've kind of regressed a little bit because this is the file on its own, and it runs on its own. So this is kind of, it's harder to test again, like our initial CGI versions of our application. And so Rack gives us another way that we can build applications as well. I mean, Sinatra. And that is Sinatra. Oh, wait. Okay, this was just another example that I didn't really talk about. But in this particular example, beyond just the regular, like, URL specification, Sinatra gives us a templating language for our URLs. So this actually evaluates into the parameter name that we can use within our request, and it gives us kind of a nice way. We can specify this as a block parameter because this is a Ruby block that we're using here, and it just becomes available as like a locally scoped variable. But to go back, take a step back, and Sinatra gives us a way that we can build up our own classes that use this DSL as well. So this becomes our own class / object that we can use. It's a Rack application, and we've done pretty much the same thing that we were doing in our other Rack application, except for now we've got a nice, pretty syntax for defining our routes and where stuff happens and whatnot. What's nice too is that this is also a valid Rack middleware. So what this means we can do is we can build up bigger applications using these Sinatra small Sinatra classes. And so essentially right here we've got a couple different things going on here. The first thing at the top, when I mentioned before, the only thing a object has to do in order to be Rack compliant is it just has to respond to a method called call. And what's awesome about lambdas is lambdas return objects that have a call method on them. So here we have a lambda that takes one argument, the environment, and then returns something. So this is our application, our Rack application for saying if you get to this point, then what you're looking for isn't here. And then we've stacked some middlewares on top of our not found application. Particularly Rack comes with a middleware for serving up a directory of things. So we're saying like the directory that's at this place public, if the name of the request matches a file that's in this public directory, then serve this and go right back out. It would never evaluate anything, any of the other applications below this. And then we've got our Sinatra middlewares that we've developed potentially that have little URL specifications all on their own. So the catalog section of our app is going to be in the catalog middleware and cart and so on and so forth. And if a request comes in and we go to /my_account or /account or whatever, what's going to happen is the request is going to go down the middlewares to the my account and say, oh, I respond to this, and it's not going to evaluate the not found and push everything right back up and bada bing. So we've got the beginnings of a large-scale web application here with very simple objects. We're not doing anything really crazy. We know exactly what's going on in this particular stack. Lastly, to bring it back to Rails, Rails provides some abstractions that are also still important to us as, I don't know, HA developers, if you would say. Rails takes a lot of these things, and I don't want to go too much into what Rails does, but Rails gives us a lot of the things that we've seen in the other places in the libraries that comes with it, like Action Controller and Active Dispatch give us our application router and our business logic and stuff that we're doing there. We've got HTML templating built in. We can make use of many different Ruby templating engines using ActionView. Data abstraction and database access, active record and active model give us. And we can do all these things with this stack now, especially that we know what's going on at all these layers. Rails gives us a really clear definition of a specific type of app, specifically CRUD applications. CRUD stands for Create, Read, Update, Destroy, things that are related to the database, and we can do them super simply with Rails and understand the stack that we're working with. Yeah. And it gives us Rails as opposed to something like CGI or Rack, and in some cases Sinatra. Rails gives us an entire setup that we use already and says, okay, your business logic fits into these little hotspots that you can work with. So yeah, and then we don't have to throw away all the work that we've done beforehand, the stuff that we've done in Rack and the stuff that we've done in Sinatra, because Rails, late Rails 2.0 and all of Rails 3 gives us a way to use middlewares within our application using a configuration setting called config middleware. And that means that any of the Sinatra stuff that we've built up, we can use right in our Rails application. As a matter of fact, Rails 3 is pretty much a collection of middlewares built up specifically to look like a Rails application. So that's cool. Last, and getting pretty close on time here, the of our learning of the web is knowing how these abstractions work and being able to choose the right tool for the job. So now that we have an understanding of the fundamentals of how Ruby classes work, we know how to start to take these things and abstract them in ways that work on many web servers and focus on very particular aspects of what we're trying to do at the given time. We now know what the best tool for the job is. We're not just going to always throw up a Rails server and then get stuck whenever we get to a certain point. We have the option to use Rails to begin with and maybe use a Rack application whenever we need to, or start out with Rack applications and say, oh, at some point Rails would make a better tool for this, and I can just take my Rack applications and kind of use them with the new Rails stuff that I'm going to do. So yeah. The takeaways from this, things that I want you to think about. If you're a complete beginner, I encourage people to consider this path dogma. If you want to start doing Rails and you're interested in it, try this out. Tell me how it works for you, because I think that it's something that's worked well for me, and I think that you should consider it. If you're already doing X if you're already doing Rails, Sinatra, Ruby, whatever, consider using this method in a code retreat style. How many people know about code retreat? Okay, this is kind of like a national, I wouldn't call it a phenomena, but it's a national thing that a guy named Corey Haynes has started doing. And essentially the point is Code Retreat is to learn how to TDD applications, do test-driven development all the time. And he focuses on the idea that like on your day-to-day job, you probably don't have the time to learn to do test-driven development because it's really tough. I mean, doing test-driven development is a really great way to build applications, but if you're not skilled in test-driven development, development, it's going to slow you down. So taking these concepts here that I have, if you think that if you've done Rails for a little bit of time and you want to try to dig deeper into what you're doing, think of it doing it that way. Take some spare time and say, okay, I'm going to start over, try building a CGI application, build it up into something like this, and then move on to how it applies to Rails. If you're a master Ruby Rails programmer already, consider telling the people that are interested in Rails about this concept and seeing if it works for you teaching them how to do things. The other things you get out of this, takeaways, you're no longer stuck with Rails is kind of what I'm trying to get across. Rails is awesome, but you don't have to be stuck with it. You have the knowledge and the experience to choose whatever you want in your situation that kind of go along with the you're no longer stuck with Rails. You get along to a point where your application is no longer scaling or it's doing the wrong thing at the wrong time. You now have the opportunity to choose the right tool for the right job. If you're really, I don't know, want to challenge yourself, I'm trying to think of the negative connotation way to say that, you might consider taking a look at the HTTP RFC 2616, and then looking at applying some of this knowledge, the low-level knowledge, trying to build up your applications in a way that they make use of cool things in the RFC, because it's not just all like Git does this, put does that. There's a lot of interesting things in the RFC about giving your application total control of the way that web requests happen, and applications that scale really know how to work with the HTTP, not just doing gets and puts. And if you decide to try out the CGI stuff, I wrote a Ruby gem specifically for running these in the same way that Rack runs its applications. It's called CGI Up. It's awesome. You should check it out. It does one thing, and you probably won't use it much. But that's it. I'm Ryan Briones. I work for Obtiva. I'm on Twitter and GitHub at that. So thank you. I think we have a couple minutes for questions, if you want them. Awesome. Well, feel free to come up and talk to me afterwards. And thank you very much for your time. I don't, and Tom said you were going to do it, or he was going to do it in the